Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Gordon Ross, and you might be expecting me this evening, because we're running a little bit late, to be talking to you straight away about Brexit. Now, for those of you who can hardly wait to hear the next exciting instalment of what's happening with Mrs May's Brexit deal, I'm afraid you will have to just hang on for a few more minutes. We will be talking about Brexit later on, and we will also be having an interview session later on about Brexit. But before we begin, I'd like to just cover some of the more important international news stories this evening. The first one of which is New Zealand's ban on semi-automatic and assault rifles. Now, you'll remember that recently there was a gun massacre in Christchurch in New Zealand involving semi-automatic weapons, with one individual managing to kill 50 innocent people and injure dozens of others. Now, New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has announced plans to ban nearly all military-style semi-automatic and assault rifles on Thursday, just 6 days after a gunman killed 50 people at two mosques in Christchurch. While characterising the policy as an immediate ban, she then clarified that it would be submitted to Parliament as legislation in the first week of April. Now, 6 days after this attack, we are announcing a ban on all military-style semi-automatics, or MSSAs, and assault rifles in New Zealand. Related parts used to convert these guns into military-style semi-automatics are also being banned, along with all high-capacity magazines. So it appears that the New Zealand government is taking this very seriously indeed. In contrast to the response in America to recent mass shootings, where there has been a much more muted response from the government and very little talk of increasing gun control. Ms Ardern expressed her dismay that previous attempts to reform the country's gun laws had fallen short, and declared that the time for the mass and easy availability of these weapons must end, and today they will. In the meantime, Ms Ardern said, the government will sharply restrict access to virtually all such weapons by reclassifying them to require a police permit, which will be denied. I can assure people that there is no point in applying for such a permit, she said. To owners who have legitimate uses for their guns, I want to reiterate that the actions being announced today are not because of you, and are not directed at you. Our actions on behalf of all New Zealanders are directed at making sure this never happens again. The government will offer generous compensation to New Zealanders to sell their weapons to the government for destruction. She said the buyback programme would cost $100 million, I'm presuming this is New Zealand dollars, and the upper figure of $200 million, depending on the number of weapons received. Already praised internationally for showing compassion and decisiveness in response to the massacre, Prime Minister Ardern's action on gun control again gained her plaudits. The United States Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said in a tweet, referring to a bill requiring background checks on all sales, Sandy Hook happened 6 years ago, and we can't even get the Senate to hold a vote on universal background checks. When Christchurch happened, and within days, New Zealand acted to get weapons of war out of the consumer market. This is what leadership looks like. So glowing praise there for the New Zealand Prime Minister for her prompt actions to remove these weapons of mass destruction from the hands of everyday New Zealanders. And now to a story which goes back several years. The Lockerbie investigation into the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 was thrown into chaos many years ago when it turned out that Abdel Basit al-Megrahi, who was the only man convicted of this crime, was set free on compassionate grounds because he was suffering from terminal cancer. But investigators into the Lockerbie bombing, which killed 270 people, when a Pan Am transatlantic flight was blown up over Scotland in 1988, are reported to be questioning at least 5 former agents of the East German police about their possible role in Britain's deadliest terror attack. The focus is said to be on the states of Brandenburg and Berlin, where most of the former agents now live. In Scotland, a team of 9 prosecutors are involved in investigating whether East German agents were actively involved with the regime of the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Crown officers have also been searching for new evidence in Libya. Prosecutors are acting independently of a separate investigation by the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission. Investigators have long believed that Abdel Basit al-Megrahi was convicted of the attack in 2001, did not act alone. Mr. Megrahi died in 2012 from cancer after being freed in 2009 by the then Scottish Justice Secretary Kenny MacAskill and allowed to return home to Tripoli. There has long been suspicion of collaboration between the Stasi and Gaddafi's secret services. Some critics of Megrahi's prosecution believe the Lockerbie bombing was carried out by Palestinian terrorists on behalf of Iran in retaliation for the US downing of an Iranian passenger jet in 1988. A cell belonging to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine had been operating in West Germany in the months before the Pan Am bombing. And now to other stories. Well, the only other story really today has got to be Brexit. And today, British Prime Minister Theresa May is in Brussels to put her case for a short Brexit extension to the 30th of June to the 27 other national leaders of the European Union. Okay, now we're going to go live now and interview an expert, actually, on political science. Hopefully we will have a connection for you in a moment. We are trying to sort it out. Hello, Anthony. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Thank you for joining us here on Scotland at 7. Now, the Brexit case today has taken another extremely dramatic step forwards, with Prime Minister Theresa May visiting Brussels to put her case for this short extension. Now, it's said now that the extension to the 30th of June is not going to happen. Can you explain to us why the European Union would not allow that to carry on to the 30th of June?
Well, as you know, the summit is currently ongoing right now. The EU27 leaders are discussing what kind of extensions they'd be willing to offer the UK and under what conditions. In terms of why they're skeptical, why certain leaders are skeptical about extending Brexit until the end of June, is because it goes past the European Parliament elections, which will take place towards the end of May. And there's a great fear of the impact on the institutions of the European Union if the UK is still in the EU past the end of May, doesn't take part in the elections, and then for whatever reason there's a longer extension and the UK does not have MEPs in the European Parliament, and then it's a question of whether or not the European Parliament can legitimately pass legislation. We're getting to the point where EU27 leaders are concerned that Brexit is starting to impact how the EU functions, and that is their primary concern.
I see. So the problems for Brexit now, as far as we can see then, are mostly of timing. As far as the European Union is concerned, they seem, at least, to have run out of patience with the British government in this regard. And they are now offering, as far as I understand it, an extension, but only to the 22nd of May. Now, why is that particular date important? Is that something critical to the European Union at that moment?
That would be the start of the European Parliament elections.
Is that
the
actual date
why
for them
they're considering that time period. But as I say, of course, the leaders are meeting right now, and so it's hard to say what they'll come up with. Other dates have been mentioned as well, including the start of May, around the 7th of May. I think reasons for that would be to try to ensure that if there's a no-deal Brexit, for instance, doesn't happen on the day before the European Parliament elections, and that would overshadow the elections. And of course, there are very many important European issues which EU27 leaders would want to see discussed and debated in advance of the election, and not have yet another important European matter taken over by Brexit. And of course, this summit, this European Council summit, wasn't supposed to be about Brexit. It's supposed to be about reforming the single market, about the EU strategy for China, and about celebrating the 25th anniversary of the European Economic Area. But yet again, the EU has to discuss Brexit, with Theresa May asking for something which they're not confident that she can deliver. And we're in what is, for all respects, a serious crisis.
Many people have been commenting that Mrs. May seems to have her own agenda here, and that the Brexit deal that she has agreed with the European Union is very personal to her. Is that the view of Europeans? Do they see Mrs. May as being the sole arbiter of the Brexit deal? Or are they prepared to speak to others, such as Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, that well, not the leaders themselves, but the European Commission and the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has met with Jeremy Corbyn. Indeed, he's met with most political leaders that have wanted to speak with him. That's been the European Commission's policy during the Brexit negotiations, is to speak to everyone. But I think it's important to recognize that this was a deal that the UK negotiated with the EU27. They all regret Brexit. They do not want Brexit to happen. But that being said, if Brexit is to happen, they are content with this deal insofar as it is a deal, regardless of whether Theresa May was the Prime Minister or whether someone else from the Conservative Party or the Labour Party were the Prime Minister. The withdrawal agreement would undoubtedly look substantially the same as to what it is now. And of course, the withdrawal agreement itself deals with the EU's exit, UK's exit issues. So the financial settlement, citizens' rights, Northern Ireland border. The key questions of the UK's future relationship with the EU are in the non-binding political declaration, which of course goes alongside the withdrawal agreement. And that is that the ambition in that future relationship is up to the UK. And as you know, Theresa May has advocated a Brexit of leaving the single market and the customs union. But in terms of the exit issues for leaving the EU, those would be the same regardless of the Prime Minister. The EU regard those as very basic questions. And under any circumstances, they'd like to see those questions resolved.
I understand that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, and the First Minister of Wales, head of Plaid Cymru, and also, I believe, politicians from the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party have all met to produce an alternative proposal this week, which they feel would adequately solve the problems that Mrs. May's Brexit has thrown up. And there, as far as I understand it, their proposal would be for there to be a further delay to Brexit, but that there would be a continuous sitting of the Commons until all of the parties in the Commons had coalesced around something which they could agree on, at which point they would then want to have a longer delay from the European Union. The question I would have is, do you think this is a realistic ambition for these other parties? Or is it more likely that Jeremy Corbyn's approach to the European Union would be more successful?
Well, in terms of an extension and the length of an extension, before the EU27 agreed to a long extension, they would really want to know what that extension would be for. They would want that to be for a political process which they would be confident would lead to a definitive resolution on Brexit, whether that's staying in the EU or whether that's leaving the EU. They normally think of that as being a general election, a people's vote, or some sort of consensus process, and that would be up for the UK to decide. So it could be along the lines of what the opposition parties, including the SNP minus Labour, are suggesting. But I think the EU27 would be very sceptical because, of course, the only way to leave the EU with a deal is to pass some form of deal. And as I mentioned, the withdrawal agreement is unlikely to substantially change, which leads on to Labour's position on Brexit, which is a very confused position. Of course, Labour Party policy, as passed at the conference, was to go through to consider trying to change the deal, trying to have a general election, and then supporting a people's vote. But we know that Jeremy Corbyn himself is a Eurosceptic, does not want to have a people's vote, and instead has gone back to arguing for a Labour Brexit. I'm very unclear what that means. As I said, the withdrawal agreement won't be substantially different, the political declaration non-binding. So I'm sure that the EU27 would be very pleased to see the UK Parliament coalesce around an agreement that they can vote through Parliament. But I think they would be very sceptical without a clear plan that's also backed by the UK government, that's something they'd be willing to go along with.
I have a press release here, Anthony, from the various parties. It's from Ian Blackford, Vince Cable, Liz Saville MP and Caroline Lucas MP. So this is from the SNP, Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru and the Green Party. And it says that we agree that the House of Commons must formulate a plan that will give the EU Council the confidence to agree a longer extension beyond the 30th of June, so that by the end of next week, legislation can be in place to prevent a no-deal Brexit. Now, do you think this particular move is a realistic option? Would the European Union go for something like this?
Well, as I say, I think the EU might be persuaded if there's a majority for finding that kind of plan in Parliament. It's almost having a plan and then getting a majority for the plan to implement it. And that requires either Labour and a chunk of Conservative MPs, or conversely, the government plus a chunk of Labour MPs to go along with the SNP and others' proposals. And that seems unlikely. Theresa May is dead set on trying to get her deal and pitting her deal versus no deal. Jeremy Corbyn seemingly wants to get into number 10 Downing Street at perhaps any cost, or indeed arguing for his Labour Brexit, which is extremely similar to Theresa May's Brexit. So it doesn't seem, even though we're in the depths of this Brexit crisis, that either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party are willing or able to move themselves in the direction of that kind of compromise. And I think that's something which is extremely frustrating to the EU. The European Council, they're all prime ministers and presidents, they're politicians, they understand the difficulties of politics, they understand domestic politics and compromises. But at this crucial moment, you would expect that people from all political parties would try to work together to find the kind of compromise that these opposition parties are articulating, and we're not in that position.
Anthony, on a related topic to Brexit, we've just received an article on the state of what has happened to exports of US whiskey since, basically since Donald Trump closed the door to imports. And other countries now are imposing tariffs on American whiskey exports, which are clearly damaging the American whiskey industry. And I can quote some numbers to you here, and I just wondered if you think these might reflect what could happen to Scotland's whiskey industry. I'll quote some figures to you here, they're quite shocking. Canada, China, Mexico and the European Union have imposed import duties ranging from 10% to 25% on US whiskey and bourbon in the last year, resulting in an 11% drop in whiskey exports in the second half, according to the Distilled Spirits Council. Now, do you think that this is a reflection of what could happen to the Scottish whiskey industry, or is this unrelated?
Well, I mean, first of all, Donald Trump's trade policy, as with most of his foreign and domestic policies, in the end, only served to the detriment of the United States and indeed to the wider world. And I don't think that's much of a surprise. But in terms of could that happen to Scotland if Scotland leaves the EU rather, with the rest of the UK? It's possible. It depends on what trade policy the UK would decide to adopt, and indeed what role Scotland might have in helping to set that trade policy. If it happens that the UK government decides to align itself more closely in trade terms to the United States, for instance, through a free trade agreement with the United States, as Theresa May and Liam Fox seem to want, Donald Trump and his administration seem to want, as opposed to striking an agreement or indeed an agreement with the EU, which is similar to being in a single market and the customs union, or as close to as EU membership as possible, then yes, that strategic choice to align with the United States might mean following more US lines on protectionism. And if that were the case, of course, partners like the EU, which is the single largest economic entity in the world, would feel obliged to respond in retaliation, depending on the circumstances. So yes, it's perfectly possible that Scotland could be caught in that kind of trade battle if it leaves the EU with the rest of the UK, and if the UK aligns with the US on trade issues.
Oh, thank you, Anthony. There's another piece of information reached us today, and this is a media release from the Scottish Greens MSPs. Patrick Harvie has basically saying that Scotland must be given a way out of the Brexit crisis. And the Scottish Greens parliamentary co-leader has today called on the First Minister to reveal her preferred timing for an independence referendum in light of the impending Brexit disaster. Now, it seems clear from the tone in Patrick's statement here that he is convinced now that Brexit cannot be stopped. Is that the considered opinion of experts like yourself? Do you hold the same opinion? Do you think it can be stopped?
I think Brexit could still be stopped. I think that it's never been more uncertain whether or not Brexit will in fact happen, considering the deadlock in the UK Parliament and the very confused position where MPs voted to start Brexit They don't accept Theresa May's deal, but they also don't want no deal. And time is running out. And we're coming to the end of the road. One of the options is to simply not leave the EU. There's not a majority for that in Parliament at the moment. But as we get closer to the Brexit cliff edge, whether it's the end of this month, or whether it's in May, or whether it's in June, the prospect of revoking Article 50 remains an option. It's a unilateral option. The UK does not need to agree that with the EU 27. The Prime Minister could do that on her own if she were so minded. We know that Theresa May is not, but we also know that many of the things Theresa May said she wasn't going to do or didn't want to happen have subsequently happened. So no, it's perfectly possible that the UK could still not leave the EU, either through a people's vote under a long extension or through revoking Article 50 without having a referendum. And we're in such an uncertain period in British politics that it's very difficult to know what will happen, not just next week, but tonight and tomorrow. So no, Brexit might still not happen, and it's a very confused picture to try to analyse.
Okay, Anthony, thank you very much. I've also here got a CBI and TUC call on the Prime Minister to change the Brexit approach. This is an interesting one. This comes from the European Summit TUC General Secretary Francis O'Grady and the CBI's Director General Caroline Fairbairn. So we're seeing calls from both the unions and employers now on the Prime Minister to change her approach on Brexit, and they've requested an urgent meeting to discuss their concerns. And I think when a Prime Minister is faced both with a trades union and an employers' organisation both calling on her to change course, there must be a real fear now amongst British industrialists and their workforces that Brexit is really going to damage the economy. How much notice do you think the Prime Minister would take of the CBI? I mean, it's one of the most important business organisations in the UK. And the Trades Union Congress, the biggest group of trades unions in the UK, both telling her that she needs to change her direction. But would she listen to this? Is it too late now for it to be turned around?
Well, no, it's not too late for things to be turned around, but I can't speak to Theresa May's own motivations, but we do know that she has been very persistent in arguing for the kind of Brexit that she wants and arguing for her deal. And it seems that no degree of opposition or defeat in the Commons or a change in mood in the public, and of course opinion polls suggest that the majority of people in the UK, if there were a second referendum, would vote to stay in the EU. Of course, that was always the case in Scotland. It's just increased. And I don't know. I don't know what Theresa May will do. She's been extremely consistent in arguing for her deal. But it is very noteworthy that both business and trade unions have come together to express, I think, both a fear of no deal, because everyone knows that would be extremely damaging to Scotland and the UK if there were no deal Brexit, but also that any form of Brexit would be economically damaging. And that's the case of the UK government's own economic analysis, of the Scottish government's economic analysis, and indeed of almost every other independent economic analysis, that any form of Brexit would be damaging. A no-deal Brexit would be especially damaging, both for businesses and for workers. Yes, and if the Prime Minister would pay more attention to those concerns, then yes, we'd probably be in a better position than we are.
Anthony, just before we leave you this evening, I wanted to thank you for giving us so much of your time this evening. I have a personal question for you, and it's one which has come to me through my own TV blog, IndyCar. That many people have asked me this question, and it is, what would happen if Scotland became independent rather suddenly on news that, say, there was a no-deal Brexit was going to happen, and Scotland unilaterally decided to declare itself separated or end the union with England? Would the European Union, in your view, take Scotland straight back in, or would they want to keep us in some kind of holding arrangement until the new agreements can be drawn up? Would we have an automatic right to remain?
Well, I suppose, on the first instance, I suppose it depends when Scotland became independent. Was the UK still in the EU at that point? But generally speaking, I think the view among the EU would be no, that Scotland would have to apply to join the EU as a new member state. And of course, that process can take a number of years. Scotland naturally has been part of a member state of the EU for over 45 years, so that's a very good starting point. I'm sure the negotiations certainly wouldn't take as long as for countries that were never in the European Union. But no, I think the view in the EU would be that Scotland would have to apply, but that there would be much more sympathy for a Scottish application than in 2014. But equally, the EU would pay very close attention to the manner in which Scotland became independent. It's important to remember that although European integration is about bringing states and peoples closer together, the EU is a union at the end of the day of states. And they would want to see any independence that they would recognise through a constitutional process that was agreed with the UK, however difficult that is for Scotland in the face of Brexit. They would only, for instance, recognise Scotland if it was a process that the UK government agreed to. But presuming that that was the case, I'm sure that Scotland would be welcomed into the EU, but it would have to apply and go through the normal accession process, which hopefully would take shorter than normal.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your time this evening. Anthony Salamonde. That is about it for Scotland at 7 tonight. Hopefully we'll be back again tomorrow night. I will be again presenting the show next Thursday. But from this edition, this is Brexit special of Scotland at 7. It's good night from all the crew here at Broadcasting Scotland. Good night.